Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everybody who is tuning in. Welcome to IFPP Speaker Series for today. Our theme is 60 years of India-Singapore relations, successes and way forward. And we have with us two distinguished guests, His Excellency Dr. Yo and Ambassador Shyam Saran. I'll speak a little bit about both of them, and just give me a moment. First, we have Mr. Giorgio, who was the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. He's currently a visiting scholar at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore and the founding patron of its Asia Competitiveness Institute. Mr. Yeo was with the Kerry Group in Hong Kong from 2012 to 2021. He was chairman and executive director of Kerry Logistics Network from 2012 to 2019. He has been in government for a long time, from September 1988 to May 2011. He served 23 years in the Singapore government and was Minister for Information and the Arts, Minister for Health, Minister for Trade and Industry, and of course, Minister for Foreign Affairs. He has a BA in engineering, double first from Cambridge University, and an MBA Baker School from Harvard University. He has a long and distinguished military career, and he has also been appointed as the member of the Pontifical Commission for Reference on the Economic Administrative Structure of the Holy See in 2013-2014, and the Vatican Council for the Economy from February 2014 to July 2020. He is a member of the Board of Trustees for a lot of institutes, including the Bergwijn Institute on Governance, International Advisory Panel of Peking University, Senior Advisory Council of Beijing Forum, International Advisory Advisory Board of IEESE Business School, International Advisory Council of China's Eco Forum, Global Goyang, International Advisory Board of Japan's National Graduate School for International Policy Studies, and a lot more. And he has recently been appointed as a distinguished non-resident fellow of the Contemporary China and the World, CCCW, at the Hong Kong University. He was also the conference chairman of the Singapore Summit from 2012 to 2016. Thank you so much, Mr. Giorgio, for coming into us and for having such an illustrious career. We only aim to even mirror some of that if some of us went to go on become diplomats. Thank you so much for joining in. Next up, we have Ambassador Shyam Saran, who was the former Foreign Secretary of India and has served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. After leaving government service in 2010, he has headed the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, which is a prestigious think tank focusing on economic issues from 2012 to 2017, and was the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board under the National Security Council from 2013 to 2015. Ambassador Saran is currently the president of the India International Center and an honorary senior fellow with the Center for Policy Research. His book, How India Sees the World, was published in September 2017, and he has now published his second book, How China Sees India and the World. On January 25, 2026, 2011, Shyam's Ambassador Saran was awarded the Padma Bhushan by the President of India for his contribution to civil service. The Padma Bhushan is the third highest national award in the country. Dr. Yo also has a Padma Bhushan. The Emperor of Japan decorated him with the Spring Order, Gold and Silver Star on July 30, 2019 for his services to promoting India-Japan relations. Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran, for joining us today. We would be highly obliged to
My pleasure.
Insights. And we'll now begin with why we have this session in the first place and the order in which we'll go with. So we all know that Singapore's president had a state visit recently for 4 days to celebrating 60 years of official diplomatic relations between the two countries. The year 2025, of course, marks this relation, which is an enduring partnership built on shared values, economic collaboration, strategic alignment, and of course, robust people-to-people ties. Today, in this 60-minute panel discussion, two distinguished experts that we have will reflect on the evolution of this relationship, critically assess its current trajectory, and envision pathways for deepening ties in a rapidly changing global order. The themes are historical foundation, economic and strategic synergies, vis-a-vis China, sustainability and climate action, and of course, what is the future of India-Singapore relations. This live session is, of course, open to all IFPP members and partners, and a transcript will be shared with a video recording to others who could not attend the live session. Thank you so much for everyone for your patience. We'll quickly start with a round of opening remarks up on reflecting on India's and Singapore's relationship so far. What are the significant foundations that govern these relationships and significant key moments as well? Um, Ambassador Saran, would you like to start?
Oh, well, I think you should give the floor to the senior colleague here. But let me just make very few short remarks. It is a privilege for me to share this panel with such a distinguished statesman like uh, Excellency George Yo. I have very much admired his work, particularly with respect to his perspectives on international developments, the role of China-U.S. relations, which is now going to be a very important topic for strategists everywhere. So where does our relationship with Singapore stand in the context of what is, I think, a very fragmenting geopolitical landscape, a highly polarized geopolitical landscape? It is also a landscape where decisions, even on economic and commercial matters, are being overshadowed by security considerations. And this is not only the United States, but we find this in many other parts of the world. So, if I look at this landscape, what strikes me is that India Singapore relations reflect a very high degree of mutual trust, mutual confidence, a kind of a comfort level dealing with one another. And this is something which is quite unusual because no two countries can be as different as Singapore. Singapore is a small island nation. Here you have India, which is like China is a giant, is now the most populous country in the world. So it is a very odd couple uh, relationship in a sense. But having said that, I think it would be fair to say that since India launched its look east policy, which then later became act east policy. We also have an Indo-Pacific strategy now. In this respect, I think Singapore plays a very, very important role. It is, for example, India's preferred platform for its commercial and economic engagement with the rest of Southeast Asia and even East Asia. It is one of the most efficient, platforms for doing business in the region. So that's a very important aspect. There are something like, if I'm not mistaken, something like maybe 2,000 or so Indian companies which are registered in Singapore. So a lot of Indian companies actually find Singapore a very convenient place to do business with the rest of the region. So that is something very important. And I think Singapore also plays a very outsized role in terms of being a kind of a partner as a very highly advanced, very highly skilled partner for contributing to India's own economic and social development. So for those reasons, I think when we are celebrating the 60 years of India-Singapore relations, there is much to celebrate how this relationship has actually evolved over the last few decades. Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Yeo.
Um, well, first, Ajitesh, thank you for having me on this program. I accepted immediately your invitation because there's much to celebrate in our bilateral relationship. And it is a great honor for me to share the same panel with Ambassador Saran, whom I have the highest regard for, and whose reputation uh, is, is precedes him. Uh, Singapore is a daughter of the Raj in India. I mean, it was established as a trading post of the East India Company. and as part of the Straits settlements, reported to Calcutta until, I think it was 1867. And much of the British inheritance, which we acknowledge in Singapore, in fact, came through India. I remember my first visit to the Indian Military Academy, Kadakwasla. And I was surprised that in the laboratories, the equipment I saw, the potentiometers, pipettes, test tubes, beakers, were identical to those I used in school. Then I realized, of course, that all the standards came from India. So not surprisingly, when Indians come to Singapore, they find much which is familiar, not only at a conscious level, but at a subconscious level. A friend of mine, Professor Wang Keng Wu, a scholar, he said, Singapore is where the mandalas of China and India overlap. And I would say, to a certain extent, the mandalas of India, China, and the West overlap in varying degrees throughout Southeast Asia. And in the last 30 years, with India reopening up, it's almost as if India and Southeast Asia have rediscovered one another. So I'm optimistic about the future of Singapore's relationship with India, of ASEAN's relationship with India. And I believe ASEAN can play a small role in creating a neutral platform where India and China can meet and discuss mutual challenges. Although bilateral relations between India and China have been a little tense, I think they will get better. They'll not get too good because both are big countries, both are distinct civilizations. But there is a considerable mutual respect, one for the other. It's almost as if each acknowledging the other as an ancient people and doffing his hat to the other. And since here in Southeast Asia, we look both east and west, that relationship is very important to us. And if in the coming years, relations between China and India are normal, hopefully better than normal, I think the prospects of peace in the region will be good. And if in the region there is peace, many things are possible. And in another generation, our societies will be transformed beyond recognition. This is the most important project. It is to keep the peace in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua and Ambassador Saran. We'll now move towards, since both of you mentioned the economic partnership and as well as the increasing ties between India and Singapore in the last 30 years. We have a lot of state visits, a lot of ministerial meetings as well, roundtables happening, increasing the last decade as well. And recently, the partnership is upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership. So why don't we unpack what that even means, and especially its focus on semiconductors? This question is open to both.
Who would you like to respond to that?
It's open to both. If anybody wants to take that up.
Excellency, would you like to comment on that?
Oh, certainly. I was very much involved in helping to improve bilateral economic relationship between India and China. When under Narasimha Rao, India embarked on the new path of reform and opening up in 1992, I led a delegation to India in 1993 and got to know both Manmohan Singh and P. Chidambaram in understanding India's new approach. And later, I was involved in negotiating the comprehensive economic cooperation agreement between India and Singapore. Although that agreement was launched with the Vajpayee government, I took care during that period to brief both Sonia Gandhi and Manmohan Singh. And when eventually the agreement was concluded with the Congress government, it enjoyed bipartisan support. And there is great complementarity between Singapore and India. Singapore can help India in here and there. Of course, we have to accept that India's development has its own rhythm, but here and there we can add value and enjoy some advantage for ourselves. But I would say on the whole, it is a very complementary relationship. There is tremendous potential, and the economic relationship is reinforced by a common strategic view of many important issues in the world, and made possible by a very high level of comfort when we visit one another.
Yeah. I would agree with His Excellency. I would like to just mention that I was Foreign Secretary at the time when the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement was actually concluded with Singapore. I must say that my uh, memories are that it was quite controversial within the Indian system. There were, some opposition to that, but I would credit Dr. Manmohan Singh for having eventually taken a call and conveying to us that this was something which would play a very important role in really cementing the relationship, not only with Singapore, but as I mentioned, that the role that Singapore could play in terms of really actualizing the potential of India's Act East policy. And for example, if you look at the period from when we signed the SICA to the present, something like 167 billion US dollars worth of Singapore investment has come into India. That is the cumulative figure. So for a small, country like Singapore, this is a very heavy investment in India. Perhaps maybe China has a larger role in this respect, but I think 167 billion is rather large. In 2023-24, just 1 year, last financial year, Singapore actually was the largest FDI source for India. Something like $11.4 billion, if I am not mistaken. I made a mistake thinking that there were only 2,000 companies, Indian companies, registered in Singapore. Actually, I just saw that there were 9,000 Indian companies which have registered in Singapore, and conversely, there are about 400 Singapore companies, including banks and other financial institutions, which are registered in India. Singapore plays a very important role in terms of external commercial borrowings for India, because again, it's a very important financial center in the region. Mention was made of the India-Singapore Ministerial Roundtable, which has been now meeting. I think second meeting took place late last year. And this is also unusual that India does not have this level of engagement, except with very few countries. I mean, with the US, of course, we have the 2+2. We have that with just a couple of other countries. So in that respect, Australia, for example, in that respect, that Singapore also has been chosen to be a country with which we should have that kind of a very broad-ranging engagement, also testifies to the fact that it is considered by India certainly as a very, very important relationship. So the economic and commercial side is really, I would say, the heartbeat of the relationship. It really is driving the relationship forward. It is true. I would say that there is a certain asymmetry in the nature of the relationship between India and Singapore and India's relations with ASEAN. If I look at the relationship with ASEAN, there has always been this complaint that India does not step up to the plate. It has fairly large resources and it has a very large growing economy, and yet its profile in Southeast Asia is suboptimal. If you look at a recent study by the ICAS in Singapore, India barely figures in the consciousness of most of Southeast Asia, which is quite unusual. If as Excellency says, that Wang Gungwu thinks that this is the place of the mandalas of China and India intersecting, the India part of that mandala is rather weak, I would say. So if I look at the relationship with the rest of ASEAN, the Indian profile is quite minimal, I would say. Certainly not up to potential. So compared to that, actually the relationship that we have with Singapore is quite unusual. It is not, it does not, take on the same kind of a character as the rest of ASEAN. So that is something that we on the Indian side have to be worried about. That here is a region which is so important to India, and yet as far as a lot of Southeast Asians are concerned, at least certainly at the popular level, there is not much consciousness of India being an important presence. If you compare it with, say, China, or you compare it with the US or even Japan, India is quite far behind. And that is something which I think is going to be a big challenge for India. And in that respect, of course, Singapore has always played a very important role, in a sense, as a champion of India in ASEAN. So I remember that when we had initially the sectoral dialogue with ASEAN, then it was raised to a kind of a national a kind of a summit level dialogue. Then we established a kind of a strategic partnership. Now perhaps we have a comprehensive strategic partnership. So in the raising of the profile of India in ASEAN, and helping India to have a greater engagement with the rest of Southeast Asia, Singapore has played I think a very important role, and I think we should acknowledge that.
No, it's in Singapore's interest to see India play a bigger role in Southeast Asia. Even when we negotiated CICA, it was very clear in our minds in Singapore that should prefigure a wider, similar engagement between India and all of Southeast Asia. Singapore was probably the strongest proponent of India's inclusion in the RCEP, because we feel that without India's participation, the RCEP would not be complete. But when India, for domestic political reasons, decided to pull out at the last moment, I think our people here were the most disappointed. But I think Ambassador Saran is right. There's much more that can be done. We should see this as an opportunity. Singapore shares the same desire for India to play a bigger role in Southeast Asia. And this is a chance for us to work together.
Thank you so much. Since you alluded to the fact that there's a lot more to be done, and including the RCEP, do you feel that this is the right stage in the political nature of both countries to revisit the agreement in the first place?
So let me acknowledge that I completely share His Excellency's view that I have been a very strong proponent of India being part of the RCEP. If the economic pillar of our relationship with ASEAN is going to be so weak, then even if you have a large, say, military presence, or you have a political presence, it remains shaky. And the RCEP offered the promise of India becoming very part and parcel of what is actually today the only really dynamic economic region of the world. And if you're looking at the future, say the next decade or 2 decades, whatever may be the political tensions that may be there, say, because of China's expanding role in the region, the US-China tensions. But I do think that this is a region which is at a time when other regions of the world, for example, the transatlantic zone, which is seeing diminishing growth, facing a lot of economic challenges. Here you have a region which is still very dynamic economically. And I think it is in India's interest that it should be part and parcel of this dynamic region. So RCEP actually offered that possibility to India. India did not finally take that risk, I think, and as a result, it is seen by the countries of the region, perhaps not in Singapore so much because of the bilateral relationship, but I think it is seen in the region as a very marginal player as far as the economic side is concerned. And unless we change that perception, unless our economic profile in the region, our economic engagement with the region is really much stronger, it will be perhaps, as I said, suboptimal. So the agenda for the future, in which our relationship with Singapore can play a very important role, is that we should have a much stronger, much more active economic profile in the region.
Your Excellency, do you have something to add? All right, there might be some technical difficulties, perhaps.
What happened? The internet connection is gone?
It seems so. Your Excellency, can you hear us? All right, we'll just give them a few moments. I'll meanwhile move to the next questions. We already discussed the centrality of Singapore and Act East and Look East policy, and the fact that we do not currently play that big of a role in ASEAN countries' perspectives. There's an impending review of the India-ASEAN deal which is coming up, and would it affect and have repercussions on the India-Singapore relations? Is my question. Your Excellency, you're back. Would you like to answer that question?
I don't know the details, but I see no conflict, but only a complementary, mutually reinforcing relationship between Singapore's bilateral relationship with India and ASEAN's relationship with India. It is in Singapore's interest for India to have stronger links to all of ASEAN.
All right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran. Do you feel?
Yes, there will be a review, and as far as I can see, there will be demands that some of the provisions of the agreement should be revisited, because there has always been an Indian, complaint that as far as India's access to markets of some of the ASEAN countries is concerned. India, for example, has strengths in the services field, as you know. So there has been some complaint that where we have strengths, we do not have as much market access as we should be having under such a arrangement, or even say some areas like, for example, pharmaceuticals, which is another area where we have strengths. So there are those kind of complaints from the Indian side, but nothing that I think, if there is interest on both sides, that this relationship should be developed much more than what it is today. I think there is no reason why we should not be able to resolve those. I would hope that, like RCEP, we do not decide to, retreat even further from our economic and commercial engagement with the region. That, I think, would be a very disappointing, posture for India to take.
I think India should take a strategic view of Southeast Asia, and therefore not be too transactional in its negotiations. India will become the world's second or third biggest economy in 20, 30 years' time. So India, seeing its own future, should see ASEAN as being an important part of its future. And against that strategic outlook, it's better to bring ASEAN deep into India and to have strong relationship. It's important while we haggle over specific items in negotiations that we also take a longer and wider view. We are talking here about creating an Asia which will be able to maintain the peace for another generation to come. It's a big project and one which potentially involves hundreds of millions of people. And India's economy will grow. It will become more and more important to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asians will want a balance between India and China and the West. And all of us in Southeast Asia want India to do well because that enables us to keep our balance for the future.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Ambassador Saran, you also served as a in the National Security Advisory Board and had a lot of relationship with China at the moment as well. How do you view India's relationship with Singapore vis-a-vis Southeast Asia and the largest context of defense, especially as Chinese military have these incursions outside of their borders into our territory as well?
Well, I mean, there is no doubt that we have a difficult relationship with China. And I cannot see that this relationship is going to dramatically change for the better in the near future. But the many years that I have had experience in dealing with China, I can also say that as the two largest emerging economies, there is a lot in common between India and China. So, for example, I was, chief negotiator on climate change. And during that period, I can say without any reservation that perhaps one of my best allies in those negotiations were the Chinese. I had a very good relationship with my Chinese counterpart, and we worked very closely together. I remember, for example, in the Copenhagen Climate Summit, we worked very closely together, and Dr. Manmohan Singh worked very closely together with Wan Jiabao at that particular meeting. Until recently in the WTO, in the multilateral trade negotiations, again, India and China had very similar interests. So there was always this sense in the leadership of both countries that even though there may be points of difference and points of tension, with regard to, for example, adjusting existing global regimes, whether it is trade or whether it is, climate or energy, it is in India's interest and China's interest to work together to bring about some adjustment in those regimes so that they reflect more the interests of countries like India and China, and not just countries like India and China, but developing countries constituency as a whole. Also, there was a sense that as far as the emerging regimes are concerned, climate change was certainly one of them. The safety of space-based assets, for example, or looking at cybersecurity, for example. In many of these new areas emerging, the new sort of global commons, if India and China were able to work together, they could shape these emerging regimes so that they were more aligned with our interests. And China recognized that what it can achieve working together with India would be much more effective than if it was going to work entirely on its own. I think what has happened, this is my perspective. I think His Excellency perhaps might have a different perspective, but my perspective is that since that particular period, where the two countries actually saw a lot of common interests with regard to regional or global issues, the China started over a period of time actually benchmarking itself more and more with the United States, and not really looking at itself as part and parcel of this group of emerging economies. So At the climate change negotiations, we had the basic group, which was essentially, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. And we worked very closely together. By the time from 2009, if you come to 2015, to the Paris Agreement, the deal that was actually adopted at Paris was worked out already by the Chinese and the Americans. That became the template for the Paris Agreement. And the Chinese never consulted the basic, whatever deal they made with the Americans. Why? Because they felt that they were now strong enough and powerful enough to be, sort of engaging at an equal level with the United States of America. And that particular kind of a thinking has, I think, continued. Although in the very recent past, perhaps because of the confrontation and tensions with the US, maybe there is some adjustment taking place. But I think that is the main reason. So even though there are complementarities in the relationship between India and China, the kind of sensitivity and the more accommodating spirit which we saw earlier, in our relationship, that over a period of time diminished. That's my perception.
I think in the last few years, because of the border conflict, a certain amount of bad blood has accumulated on both sides. And it will take a while before that bad blood dissipates through the system. But the underlying goodwill for each other is still there. I noticed between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, they are very careful to maintain proper relationship between themselves. And they have met many times in Ahmedabad, in Xi'an, in Wuhan, in Mahabalipuram. And I think it's possible to restore relationship to a working level. It's in both sides' interests. Both sides have a view of the world which is similar, which is multipolar, based on non-interference, based upon national sovereignty. There are, of course, problems in the relationship, trade, maybe terrorism, and so on. But these can be managed. Even the border problem will eventually be managed. I mean, take, say, China's long border with Russia. It took them a long time to demarcate that border. But it has been demarcated. And when they look back, I think both sides ask themselves, what was all that unhappiness about? And I believe the same thing will happen one day with the border demarcation between India and China. If you look at the big issues in terms of development, in terms of working together to secure a peaceful future for Asia and the world, in managing big power relationships, in managing environmental challenges, I think both India and China have much to gain by working together. I mean, together they make up 40% of the world's population. I think together they may well account for half global brain power. In Singapore, we have the largest concentration of IIT and IIM graduates in the world, in any city outside India. And it's been to our benefit. And they connect us to a wider world. But we also have in Singapore a huge concentration of Chinese intellectuals and businessmen. And they connect us to another part of the world. So the benefits of working together are immense. And I hope now that bilateral relations between China and India have closed one chapter and opened a new one, however tentatively, I hope year by year there'll be improvements. And if there's any way we in Southeast Asia can play a helpful role, naturally we will do so.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Ambassador Saran. Moving on to defense and these strategic partnerships. In 2017, I remember the then Defense Minister of Singapore stated that he encouraged the Indian Navy to visit the Changi naval base more often because of Chinese incursions. And also after that, there were a lot of maritime exercises conducted by both parties. Your Excellency, what is your perspective on the developments between India and Singapore's defense collaboration? And is there something more to be achieved or something to be toned down?
Our defense relations have been improving steadily. Our army, in fact, our armed services now train in India. I believe we even conduct live firing there. I think we do it on our own, and we do it together with our Indian friends. So we see that as a very important relationship. We do not see the relationship, our relationship with India, as being in some way a zero-sum relationship in a relationship with other powers. So we welcome Indian ships to use our facilities. We also welcome Chinese ships to use our facilities. But of course, it's the Americans who use our facilities the most. And what we want is for the great waterways, the Straits of Singapore, the Straits of Malacca, on one side opening to the South China Sea, and on the other opening to the Bay of Bengal, to be open to trade, to the free movement of peoples. This is our lifeline. For Singapore, this is our aorta. So what we want is peace, cooperation, respect for one another, dissipation of unnecessary suspicions. And this is a Southeast Asia which we are working hard to establish. Neutral, friendly to all powers, welcoming to all powers. And I think such a Southeast Asia is very good for India.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We'll now move towards, since we already had the discussion about climate change and sustainability and India and China's relationship as well. Is there any, what is the impact and what lessons can we learn perhaps from Singapore's sustainability measures, especially its public transportation systems, as well as other initiatives in the global sphere? Your Excellency, perhaps you can start.
Well, Singapore is a city-state which is well run. I remember once having a conversation with Chandrababu Naidu, who is now Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh. I said, without false modesty, I said Singapore is too small to be a model for India. His reply to me was, Singapore may be small, but it's like nanotechnology. It squeezes a lot into a small space. It was a compliment from him, which I've never forgotten. I think Singapore, as a municipal model, it's interesting for India in how we run infrastructure, how we welcome investors, how we make their lives easier, how we facilitate the movement of goods and services, provide good municipal services like healthcare, clean water, parks, facilities for foreigners, international schools, religious institutions, and so on. So I think at that level, Singapore may well be a model for other Indian cities to study, both for the mistakes we have made and for some of the achievements that we've made. And I think it's in Singapore's interest also to also learn from India's experiences. Someone said, hey, do you know that Bangalore Airport is better than Changi? Well, I've not been to Bangalore Airport for a long time. I remember how many years ago, when I was in Bangalore, they talked about Singapore. And they talked about how a private airport could learn quickly. Well, Indian airports, as we all know, have improved tremendously. Infrastructure in India has improved tremendously. The cities still have some ways to go, but that's because you have a huge population. But I believe between the cities of India and Singapore, there's much that we can benefit by mutual exchange.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Ambassador Saran, you were, again, India's chief negotiator on climate change. Do you have any anecdotes or some insights to share where you encountered and had discussions with the Singaporeans on that matter?
Well, not in any sort of significant way. Of course, um, in any multilateral negotiations, every every vote counts. Every country's support counts. So in that context, of course, as I would lobby with other countries, I would certainly also lobby with our Singapore friends to support the Indian viewpoint in the negotiations. Uh, India's view at the negotiations, sometimes India is presented as the bad boy, and India which always says no. When the Americans say no, nobody blames them for saying no. But if India says no, then India is the bad boy. India was actually not projecting Indian positions so much. What India was saying very simply was, you have a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been negotiated by consensus. It is a document to which you have signed up. And therefore, all that we want you to do is to deliver on the commitments that you have made, freely made in that convention. So if you look at India's position at the climate change negotiations, it has always been that what the Western countries particularly had been doing was to eviscerate the UNFCC, hollow it out, and in which they have succeeded brilliantly. uh, as you can see, with great fanfare, they said at Copenhagen, $100 billion per year, to be given to developing countries for their climate change action. Uh, Nobody ever saw much of that 100 billion in any case. Then now they have, when it was regarded that $1 trillion a year would now be necessary for climate change actions, they have now said $300 billion, but $300 billion from all possible sources, including philanthropic flows. It should come as no surprise that India considers the position taken by certainly the United States of America and most of the developed countries as being very hypocritical. I mean, they make a lot of noise, but I think they have no intention whatsoever of really delivering on their limited commitments. Now, the general assumption is that this is a problem which will be mainly of the developing countries, particularly those in the tropical countries. We in the Western countries, in the temperate zones, we are safe. If there was that kind of assumption, you can see that if Hollywood is burning, then to think that there are places that are safe from what is really a global phenomena, I think that assumption should be now discarded. We are in it together, and therefore, unless we work together, I think it would be difficult to deal with a challenge like this. So, in that, I do not think that our view is very different from Singapore. Certainly, with respect to certain what His Excellency mentioned, we have in India, climate change problem is linked together with, for example, waste management. It is linked together with pollution, particularly urban pollution. You see the kind of dangerous levels of pollution we have in New Delhi, India's capital. So in these respects, it's not purely climate change, but it is something which is integrally linked to the climate change challenge. I think Singapore's experience in as a city state in managing, for example, waste, in making certain that you control pollution. Singapore, with the kind of per capita income it has, the density of car ownership in Singapore is surprisingly low. Why? Because its public transportation is so good. And in India, you cannot have the level of car ownership, for example, which you have in the United States. or you have in Europe, not even a fraction of that. While India is moving in that direction, it is building more flyovers, it is building more highways. This does not benefit the common Indian. So you have perhaps remember the great controversy in Delhi because there were bus corridors made, for the 83% of the population of Delhi moves by public transportation, by buses or on bicycles or walking. But it would be fair to say that the whole infrastructure development in Delhi is geared to satisfying the car owner. So I think these are kind of lessons, even if it is an affluent country. Singapore has understood that, it cannot sustain the kind of, urban life that you have in, say, cities like New York or London, other places. It has very wisely gone in for, public transportation. And I think those are the kind of lessons we should learn from Singapore.
No, I always feel that India should not try too hard to please other countries. Just look after your own people. And you will help the world by looking after your own people, for sure. And on issues of the environment, of climate, I think India can do a lot to help itself. And that will be its greatest contribution to the world. And it cannot be done top down. It has to be done organically from the bottom up. Of course, you still need policies, but it's important to do things from the bottom up also and involve ordinary people, because in the end, it's not about the big issues. It is how their daily lives are affected. And if you look after them well, naturally the environment will improve. And that'll be India's greatest contribution to the world. I mean, Trump has just pulled up from the Paris Accord. And when the war in Ukraine happened, many European countries just gave short shrift to environmental considerations. So when it suits them, they will change policy. Okay, that's the way of the world. So the most important thing for us is we look after our own people. We try to do that in Singapore on a small scale. In India, if you can do that on a much larger scale, will make a big impact on the world.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Ambassador Saran. Since we are coming short on time now, I'll ask my final question, then we move on to closing remarks and then to audience Q&A. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the Indian diaspora's impact on our bilateral relations with Singapore. But there are also concerns in online public forums in Singapore on the rising anti-India sentiments as well as racism towards India in the region. Is this a fleeting kind of incident, or is it a phenomenon that's actually going to affect bilateral relations in the near future?
It is to be expected. I lost my constituency elections in 2011. And during that general elections, a big issue was the influx of too many mainland Chinese into Singapore. In the last general elections in Singapore, the political attention during the elections went to India. So this is something which has got to be managed. The numbers that we allow in and the manner in which we help foreign communities integrate into local communities so that their presence is seen as a blessing to host communities. And here I'm always reminded of the Parsi story when they left Iran and they arrived, I think it was in Gujarat, and the local Raja pushing a glass of milk filled to the brim, suggesting that the land had no space for them. So the Parsi leader scooped up in his fist sugar and gradually melted it into the milk, and the milk did not spill. It's very important when we are foreigners in the host community to sweeten the milk. Then we are seen as a blessing to local communities. But if we are arrogant and we think that we are benefiting them and that we have a right to be here, then inevitably there'll be a political reaction which has got to be managed. So in Singapore, this is something which must be done between the Indian community, which has arrived, and the local community, which has every vested interest in helping them settle in.
Ambassador Saran, do you have any more comments?
Oh, well, I would say that overall, if I look at the Indian diaspora, not only in Singapore but many other countries, what is actually very striking is that Indian communities are very adaptable to the host societies, and they manage to sort of establish a fairly good relationship with their host communities. There will always be exceptions, but I think generally speaking, they have been more adaptable than perhaps one may have expected, and they have also maintained some of their cultural roots, their religious roots. The danger that I see is that some of the divisions which you see in India don't get exported to Indian communities abroad. That would be a problem. So if the kind of political confrontation, or the kind of ideological confrontation which you sometimes see in India, sometimes I see that these are getting reflected in Indian communities abroad as well. That is a worrying trend. With that caveat, I would say that generally speaking, Indians have done well for themselves. They are respected in the communities that they are part of, and I would hope that that continues.
Thank you so much, Your
It's a manageable problem. And if we manage the problem, we'll keep the problem small.
All right. Thank you so much, Your Excellency and Ambassador Saran. I'll move on to audience Q&A, and then we'll end with the closing remarks. Anybody who wants to ask a live question can raise their hand, and I will allow access. I'll also, meanwhile, look at the written Q&As that we have received so far. All right, Srirang, please go ahead.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Please.
Yeah. Hi. Um, so it was a really lovely session, and thank you for helping us and giving your views on it. It's been very insightful. My question was, considering sort of this new rising trend, and we recently saw massive investments into the field of AI. I wanted to ask, how can sort of India and Singapore have more economic relations in this sort of future of AI? How collaboration could lead to innovation and also mutual economic gain.
Your Excellency or Ambassador, and whoever wishes to answer the question.
I think this is an area where India and Singapore should work together. Singapore government is giving a lot of attention to the development of AI, and we are making sure that our population is prepared for its challenges. But of course, however prepared we are, some of the challenges will be overwhelming, but we must try our best. And we are a small municipal model. I think we can be helpful to India as it develops its own response to AI. So Singapore is, as it were, already to play a partnership role with India. But as for India itself, it is a huge country, and the challenge of AI will have to be taken at different levels.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. We have another question, and from Rajnanandini. Please go ahead. Rajnandini, please go ahead. I have given you access. So.
Yeah, thank you. So there has been this Asian value debate which has been countering the liberal world order of Western countries. So in this multipolar world, what is the future of this Asian value debate, and what can be the role that India and Singapore together can play to promote these ideas? Thank you.
Well, I would point to some of the musings of His Excellency, where I think he has said that perhaps the most important value is respecting diversity, respecting and also acknowledging the great diversity that exists, not only in Asia but even in particular Asian countries. And as long as there is this respect for diversity, where you do not impose a singular kind of a scale of values on people, different people have different ways of thinking, different ways of living, and you should make allowance for that. I would say that in their own ways, both India and Singapore are examples of how plural societies can actually work and flourish. You know, so Singapore has a diverse population, and it has managed to they have a Singapore identity, but it doesn't mean that therefore they have to suppress their own identity as different ethnic or religious or social groups. I think that has been the case with India as well, even greater diversity that India has. So this is something which perhaps does not conform to the Western liberal values or the scale of liberal values, but I think for me the most fundamental aspect of if there is an Asian value system, I think I cannot say that there is one singular, Asian value system. But to me, Asian value system is precisely the respect for plurality. Uh, and as long as we respect that, I think Asia will probably be have much greater chance for peace and for greater affinity with one another than perhaps is the case today in most of the Western world.
Thank
I'm,
you.
I'm in full accord with Ambassador Saran. And I think on this issue, Asians, and we're all ancient peoples, know better than to try to suppress identities and convert others to be like ourselves. No Indian wants to make a non-Indian to be Indian. No Chinese wants a non-Chinese to become Chinese. And in Southeast Asia, we are so diverse in Southeast Asia, it's our starting point that we accept our diversity. Next year will be the 70th anniversary of Bandung. 70 years ago, in Indonesia, in Bandung, Nehru, Zhou Enlai, many other leaders from Asia and Africa met in order to distill certain principles which govern the relationship between countries and peoples. That there should be respect for one another. There should be mutual non-interference, that we should work for mutual benefit. And these are the values which the world desperately needs. The idea that we must all conform to one set of values will only mean that we are condemned to perpetual conflict. And here, I think India, I think 70 years ago, between India and China, there's a common declaration on Panchal, the five principles, which became the Bandung Declaration. This is something we should almost re-emphasize, that this is the only way by which we can live at peace with one another, beginning by respecting that everybody, every human being is different, is created unique, and has to be respected in his uniqueness and identity.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I will allow just one final question since we are already over time. Raghav, just quickly speak up.
Yes, thank you so much, Your Excellency and Ambassador Saran, for such a wonderful talk. My question is directed to His Excellency Ambassador Yo. Singapore has done a great job dehyphenating between India and China. And like you suggested, Singapore has played a key role in facilitating peace between India and China. So, what is your assessment of how Singapore can play a role in the future of India China ties as a peacemaker of sorts, given that you have not a thaw under disengagement? You have a slight thaw, but not really a shift, which is what Ambassador Saran once said in a talk. So, thank you. Would like to get your perspective.
It is true that every time there's news of bad blood between India and China, that the people in Singapore, Indians, Chinese, Malays, all feel conflicted. It's almost as if father and mother are quarreling. And people feel very unhappy. And there's nothing more pleasing to us than to see Chinese and Indian leaders smiling at one another. Everybody feels much more relaxed. Therefore, our emotional position is to be a peacemaker, not to be never to be a troublemaker. But of course, we know that we are just children. We cannot be interfering in the affairs of adults. But if in little ways we can make things a little better, we try to be. And we speak to both sides and try to understand the views of both sides. But our overwhelming interest is in good relations between India and China.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Can we have quick final remarks on the future of India-Singapore relations? We have already covered areas that we need to focus on a lot more, trade and India's position in ASEAN, as well as economic relations. Are there any more areas that both of you feel that we have some scope of improvement? Ambassador?
Excellency?
All right, Your Excellency.
Okay, I'll go first. I think India's greatest contribution to the world is its economic development. And it's heartening to see how year by year, conditions in India have improved. There's still a million problems, and the challenges will still be there for a long time to come. But for those of us who visit India regularly, in terms of health standards, quality of infrastructure, level of education, business conditions, capabilities, there are immense improvements. And sometimes India does well because of government. Sometimes it does well despite government. There is an organic quality to India's growth and to the development of its middle classes and its domestic market. We cannot affect India's internal evolution, but we follow it closely and we adapt and adjust ourselves to those changes.
Ambassador Saran.
Well, I don't really have very much to add to what we have already talked about. As far as India-Singapore relations are concerned, if I look at it in the larger geopolitical context, from my perspective, the most significant challenge to India, and I'm talking about challenge, not necessarily a threat, is going to be China. And the fact that both India and China are sort of rising more or less at the same time, as China's periphery expands, as India's periphery expands, the mandala that Wang Kung-Wu was talking about, that mandala at some points can become points of tension and points of confrontation. So managing that is a complex challenge. And I think this will preoccupy India for quite some time to come. I have always seen Singapore as a very good place where conversations between India and China can take place. Let me make the point. I'm not minimizing the role that Singapore or any other country can play in improving relations between India and China. But this has to be done by India and China. I do not think that any other country can actually play any kind of a major role. So this is a India-China problem. The two countries have to decide whether they want to really have good relations or not. Uh, I'm somewhat optimistic. Why? Because uh, at least for 40 years before the recent clashes took place, despite having a difficult border issue, India and China actually maintained peace and tranquility at the borders. This was a more peaceful border than, for example, India's borders with Pakistan. You know, um, I have attended meetings in Beijing where the Chinese ministers say, why are we having this kind of a tense relationship with the United States or with other countries? Look at India and China. This is an example of how mature countries handle, differences between them. So I have seen that phase as well, where China is actually presenting India-China relations as a model for other countries to follow. There are, any number of reasons why what happened in 2020. I think it was unfortunate. I certainly, on the Indian side, there was a feeling of betrayal because there are any number of consultative mechanisms from the brigade level, going right up to the CMC level, the Chinese Central Military Commission, where if you can't solve a problem at this level, then you raise it and you raise it until you go right to the top. We don't know why they did not use it. That particular mechanism, which had been working so well for the last 40 years, it was not that we did not have problems at the border before. We did have problems, but we had a mechanism in place in order to deal with those kind of problems and deal with them successfully. That is what came to an end, which is what we do not understand. There is an opacity about the Chinese system which is difficult to sometimes understand. But I take that experience of 40 years as a good example and a good augury for the future. That if we are able to get over this, then maybe we can once again bring the relationship back on track. It has not yet got back on track, but it could. And in this, I think, because as His Excellency said, that India, China confronting each other is not a very happy situation for most of Southeast Asia. No Southeast Asian country wants to be caught in a crossfire between China and the US, and they don't want to be caught in a crossfire between India and China as well. And this India has to recognize. And just as I think China also has to recognize. So I remain somewhat optimistic that for no other reason but in their own interests, perhaps India and China will see their way into at least moving the relationship to a degree of trust and also cooperation.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Today's session has been increasingly insightful throughout every single section that we have went through. And since we are already so much ahead of time, I'll now invite Medha Gupta, who is the head of our speaker series, to deliver the thank you note and end the session formally.
Thank you.
Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible and visible. On behalf of the Indian Foreign Policy Project, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished panelists, His Excellency Mr. Giorgio and Ambassador Shyam Saran, for their presence with us and sharing their invaluable perspectives on this milestone achieved. Their wealth of knowledge and profound experience have truly enriched our understanding on how India and Singapore have managed to sustain these ties in a changing global order while also addressing the challenges and upcoming opportunities. This event would not have been possible without the profound contribution of division heads, members, and the founding committee of the Indian Foreign Policy Project. A special thanks to B.R. Neeraj and Ajitesh Vishwanath. Lastly, we would like to thank the audience for their active participation and thoughtful engagement throughout the session. As we go towards the conclusion of the event, we hope to carry forward the spirit of dialogue and cooperation that lies at the heart of diplomacy. Let's continue to think critically about India's way and Singapore's way and grow our shared passion for international relations and diplomacy through more such sessions in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Excellency. And I hope to see you sometime in Singapore.
I look forward to that, Ambassador Saran.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ajitesh, Media.
Thank you so much, His Excellency. Thank you so much, Ambassador.